Anyway, lovely to see so many of my friends, as you all are again, and some people who've never been here before. And as I said, I really hope you enjoy it. This series is looking at minor repercussions, I suppose, of the sort of tumultuous events of the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And I want to look in the three lectures at events that you wouldn't have thought would have taken place. When you think of these wars, you think of, you know, victories, reconstructions of Europe, monarchs, the fall, different administrative ideas. But what I want to do with this series is to look at how it affected, for example, a painter, Jacques-Louis David, who, had it not been for the Revolution and for Napoleon, probably would have eked out his days as a sort of, you know, mediocre painter for the French court. But of course he has this enormous occasion to find that in actual fact he's a great sort of impresario, and as we're going to see next week, his work is with Robespierre is going to be so impressive that it will be taken up by Hitler at the Nuremberg rally. So I think these sort of interesting ideas across sort of centuries are something that I'm looking at. Also, we'll be looking at the life of a rather minor Venetian noblewoman who again would have eked her way, you know, boring on the Grand Canal of Venice, but who, because of the Napoleonic invasions, ends up having to work at the Viennese court, at the French court, and finally eking out a living being the landlady for Lord Byron, of all people. Yes, wow. Well, what I wanted to look at today was not so much the biography of people, but of objects and the trajectory of objects which have been taken time and time again. And I'm referring to what is popularly known as the bronze horses of St. Mark's, and I'll be questioning whether they are actually bronze, and in fact they should be at St. Mark's. And we'll also be looking at the Ghent Altarpiece, which many of you have seen with me, and Tacitus's Germania. This is a classic Roman text. Now, all of these objects are plunder of war, one way or another. And the idea of plunder and what we are doing with it in modern times is something that I would like to investigate at the end of the lecture. Now, people, at least conquests, take certain iconic objects for numerous reasons. First of all, by taking an object such as the horses from St. Mark's, they didn't just conquer Venice, but they conquered it culturally as well. So this meant that they really took away the identity of the people who they have conquered, and so it's a sort of an added humiliation. The other thing that you'll see when we're looking at the horses of Venice and the Ghent Altarpiece also is the way in which these pieces have been taken to add to a narrative, or kind of a mythological narrative that the conquerors wished to construct around themselves. With Venice, of course, it's the idea of being the child of Byzantium, but queen of the Adriatic. With the Ghent Altarpiece, when it's taken by Napoleon, it's taken to show that, you know, this is going to be the new Rome, and that Paris is going to be the new centre of the artistic world. Now, the other thing that we will examine with these particular pieces of art are the way in which particularly Hitler and Napoleon, and I'm sorry that I have to sort of link them in the same sentence, but you know, it has taken, you know, I've had to have a few coffees to be able to do this, was trying to create the idea of a universal museum. In other words, that it wasn't going to be Berlin, it was going to be Linz in the case of Hitler, where all the great artworks of Europe, and in fact, hopefully of the world, would come together in this one artistic place. The same thing was attempted by, of course, Napoleon, who wanted Paris to be the centre. And I want, at the end of the lecture, to look at the British Museum. Yes. Yeah. All right, so let's start out by looking at the horses of St. Mark's, as they're known. In other words, we associate them as being Venetian. I want to go to Paris in 1789, after the conquest of Italy by Bonaparte, who is not yet Napoleon. He's not yet the emperor, hasn't crowned himself, but he's already conquered most of Italy, parts of Austria, and brings back in a triumphal procession all of the great works of art from the countries that he has conquered. Now, Napoleon would probably be the first sort of general in the sort of modern era to actually have embedded within his staff and within his army a group of people who were dedicated to taking, some people would say looting, I won't use that word, obtaining significant works of art. And the list was made up by a man called Vivant Denon, D-E-N-O-N. Those of you who go to the Louvre will know that the whole part of the Louvre, of course, is a wing of the Louvre, is named after him. He was the great Egyptologist, the great person who was given the command by Napoleon to set up the Louvre with the treasures that had been taken from Egypt and which hadn't actually been purloined by the British on the way. All right, so we have then this triumphal procession where all these works of art which have been marked out by Denon and taken by Napoleon come in a triumphal procession. So you have the Laocoon, you have the Capitoline Venus, all of these great works of art. You also have animals from exotic climes. People hadn't really seen much in the way of camels. You have different plants. All of this is in a triumphal procession, all right? Very similar to the kinds of processions that you would have had when a Roman general entered Rome after having defeated his enemies. Napoleon, of course, wanting to make Paris the new Rome, takes over the ceremonies, right? And we're going to look at these ceremonies when we look at Constantine. And the central piece of this is something that Napoleon himself had decided to take, and it was these so-called bronze horses of St. Mark's. Now, these horses aren't just any horses, right? These are horses from a quadriga. In other words, they're the four horses. A quadriga is the Roman word for a chariot. And the Roman chariot had immense significance in Roman secular life and religious life and military life as well. All right, I also want to, so that you can see that these are chariot horses because of the collars that they have around their necks. Now, at this time, for some reason, I can't understand why the Romans, who were such great engineers, had not worked out that if you actually have the harness around the withers of the horse, they can pull much greater, larger chariots, whereas of course they're actually rather strangled with these pieces that they have around their necks. I also want you to note the position of the heads of the horses because it's actually quite important. They'll be altered by the Venetians. All right, so there are three reasons why this quadriga was important. First of all, it was connected with the gods. Jupiter, and in particular the sun god who drove his chariot across the sky, did so behind four horses in a four-horse chariot. And this was translated into the rituals when a Roman general, having conquered his enemies, came back into Rome. He would drop his arms outside, more or less at the Rubicon, which is often quite a long way outside Rome, come unarmed in through a triumphal arch which would have been manufactured for him, usually with four white horses, and would go up the Via Sacra up to make sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter. All right, he would come along with someone, actually a slave, running along behind him saying, "You are just a man, you are just a man," even though, of course, he felt that he was a god. And he was actually made up with extraordinary makeup to make him look as though he was like Apollo or Jupiter. The soldiers used to run along making obscene jokes about his sexual exploits as well, to make sure that everyone realised he was just a man as well. Very strange, really, but anyway. All right, now if you actually know the Arch of Titus, you will see these quadriga appearing again and again. There's very few of them which are left. This is in the Roman Forum. You would know this is Titus coming back from his conquest of Judea, having slaughtered the Jews. Now, Napoleon, when he actually gets hold of this quadriga, places it on the Arc of the Carousel, which is a fake or a copy of the Arch of Constantine, and we're going to be talking about Constantine in a moment. So here you have the horses, as you see that they've actually in a different position. Notice the heads in a different position from the ones that we have now. These will have to be, of course, given back at the time of the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. Now, the other reason why the horses of the chariots were important were for chariot races. All right, now chariot races were extremely important events. They started out at 650 BC with the Greeks. In fact, they're even mentioned in Homer with Patroclus's time at the chariot race at one of the funerals. And they, by the time of Caesar, Julius Caesar, are one of the most important Roman spectacles. And these spectacles were extremely important, first of all, because they were given by the magistrates or by the generals or by the consuls, to actually win over people, to actually make sure that they were voted into office or maintain their power. This, of course, becomes totally corrupt as you get on later. So the Circus Maximus actually is at the base of the Apennine Hill. It's an immense structure which actually still exists today. You can sort of see how immense it was. I think it took 120,000 spectators at one time, and I think it was 1,000 feet long and 300 feet wide, and 12 chariots, as we'd see, would whiz around what is called the spina in the centre. Now, these chariot races were immensely popular. They were divided into 4 groups. There was the red, the green, the blue, and the white. Not particularly sort of, charismatic names as opposed to the magpies or the bombers or something like that. But they were followed fanatically, when that's where you get the word fan coming from. And they were important because the emperor also would be able to show himself to the people. All right, so this was sort of a seemingly democratic form of display, and theoretically also the people could ask questions, put forward petitions to the emperor. I mean, this ended very early on, but this was the basis behind that. So these were these extraordinary events. Now you notice the way in which the chariot here, the horses on the outside are going to the outside and the ones in the middle are going. I just wanted to give you this view of the chariot races from Ben-Hur. If you remember that. Dangerous time was going around the corner, all right? It was an extraordinarily dangerous event, terribly exciting. People used to sit, as they do still in the Grand Prix, watching things go over. All right? Now, I was interested actually that they actually restaged that chariot sequence actually in 2016. It was already done, I think, in very early cinema in 1924, and I think 180 horses died. Well, no one cared about animals then. They actually, this is completely aside from everything else, they actually used to drill holes in the hooves of the horses, and at a certain point when they wanted to make them look as though they're going to collapse, they would then have wires, and the chariot driver would pull it up and the horse would collapse. All right? And 180 is a huge number to die just for one. I think it was a 4-minute sequence. When they actually did Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston, they won't say how many died, but the estimate is probably about 10 or 15. And in fact, at the end of the chariot race, you actually see a dead horse. The one that they've just done now, they've got horse trainers and all the rest of it there, but I imagine that the horses are badly treated anyhow. That's part of it. All right, so these people who actually won the chariot races were absolute heroes, and so you actually, this is a mosaic from one of the floors of the Roman villas where you have the man who has won. He belongs to the red team. There he is with his palm of victory, and these just like the gladiators who actually won several races or many races were immensely rich, and they were the object of sort of cult adoration, a little bit like the Hollywood stars of today. And in fact they actually had statues made of them. This is the Auriga of Delphi in 500 BC. This is how important a chariot driver was. Well, now we sort of jump a number of years ahead, right? So we've established then the importance of the chariot races and these horses, which were bred specially. They were herds of horses which were bred. They were, given special food and everything to be able to have the strength to go round. I think it was 12 times. We now jump to the Emperor Constantine in 312 AD. Now, Constantine, the Roman Empire, had been divided by now by Diocletian up into the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. Constantine comes to power in the Western Empire and manages to come across and in a battle, famous battle, defeats the emperor of the West and becomes the emperor of all of the Roman Empire again, all right, in 313 AD. And this is one of these famous turning points that the Christian Church makes a sort of huge meal of, and this is the fact that Constantine, who was an extremely sort of savvy politician, realised that he was slightly outnumbered at the Milvian Bridge, which is actually just a horrible traffic jam now just outside Rome, and says on the evening of his fight that he sees a sign in the sky, and the sky is the Kiro, which are the Greek initials of Christ, and evidently there's a vision that says, put this sign on the the shields of your soldiers and you will win. This has of course been elaborated by the Christians over the centuries. In actual fact, Constantine realised that he had a huge number of Christians already who were in the legions, and secondly, this idea of a new god appearing, as it often happened at times of great sort of military strategies and military battles. Often there was a new god which would come and promise victory. This was actually just simply taking on the Christian god. Anyway, he does prevail over Maxentius and will go on to tolerate the Christian religion for the first time. And in fact, he's going to, I think in 1313, you actually, there's a law outlawing people persecuting Christians, and by 326 he actually establishes the Nicene Creed, mainly because he was horrified about these Christians because they were all fighting each other already. All right, the Arians and the Orthodox couldn't work out, the idea of the Trinity and so on. So he does actually become someone who is interested in Christianity for his own purposes. But of course he's not going to negate the importance of the pagan gods. So when he actually constructs this is just next to the Colosseum, I'm sure most of you know it, he constructs his arch. You've already seen it we know with Napoleon builds the same thing. He has a number of these medallions in it where he shows himself as a Roman god behind a quadriga, all right, and also as well as Apollo, all right. So he sort of nods to Christianity, not on this arch, but in other ways, but make sure he has a foot in both camps. So what he is going to do, what have I done? He actually decides he is going to set up the capital of the Roman Empire is going to be Byzantium. He's going to call it Constantinople. And he is going to build all of the major structures that existed already in Rome, all these ceremonial structures, because it wasn't just for sport, it was an iconic structure, the Circus Maximus, which spoke of the power of the emperor. And he will have a number of, there's still the worship of the sun god, and that's why I actually had here these obelisks, of course, which had been captured from Egypt, which they thought related to sun worship, and of course the Romans worshipped Apollo. So all of these aspects are in this circus, which will be built in Constantinople. Now, I just wanted to give you this view of the starting blocks for the chariot races, where you had the 4 teams who actually fielded 3 each. All right, of course they had their star group, but also others who were there to block, a bit like the Melbourne Cup, really, who people from the same stable were there to block other people and so on. I'm extremely cynical, but anyway. All right, now what we actually have, you will see up here, is a group of horses which are in the structure, or with their heads in the way they will be at St. Mark's. Now, from different historians, we know that there were 3 sets of these quadriga horses, and one of them was taken at the beginning of the season of the games with an image of the god of luck. Down from where Constantine would be. Constantine would parade around, and then this quadriga would be placed back. So the problem then came for historians, which of these 3 quadriga, which we know existed at the time of Constantine, because they're on medals, or they're on coins, or have been mentioned, which of these 3 are going to be the ones that end up in St. Mark's after we have the 4th Crusade? Well, I just want to look at these for a moment. They now think they know which one, and you might think this is trivial, but it's absolutely fascinating sort of detective work working this out, because it's very difficult with metal objects to be able to date them. You can't analyse paint really. You can't analyse the wood with where you actually sort of work out from the wood how long it's been demmed, something or other. It's much more difficult. However, what they have noticed is that these are actually not made of bronze at all. They actually look like it, but in fact they have a gilding. They have a gold covering. And once you realise that they have a gold covering, you realise that, of course, they can't be bronze, because you can't actually, unless you just put a film of gold which will wear off under the weather and wear off, it can't have been bronze because it won't adhere. It must have been copper. Now, copper evidently has a melting point of 1,800 degrees, something incredibly high, which meant that it needed people who were extremely skillful in doing this. And they've worked out that this came across from China, as most things seem to have done, and it didn't reach the Western world till probably about the 2nd century AD, right? And once it was here, they then found a way of moulding these. Now, this was done by the lost wax technique, where you actually have the sculpture inside. You then cover it in wax, and then there's a ceramic surround outside, and then the molten copper is poured down through tubes, and the wax melts, and you end up with the hollow structure of the hollow statue. Now this is, of course, the reason why you could actually move these things. If they'd been solid, it would have been impossible to do this. So this technique with copper was only managed to be perfected at this time. Secondly, who would be able to have the money to be able to gild them? Well, it obviously had to be an emperor, and this again was an extremely difficult technique. You could have just gilded it, but it would have, put a coating, but that would have worn off. And so what they had to do was to melt mercury, boiling mercury, with gold, and then put it in a paste onto the copper, and then heat the mercury off. Well, you can imagine that the fumes would have been appalling. People knew that it was a very short-lived, often highly skilled artisans who had been captured from other countries would have done this. Now, the other thing that always intrigued people is how come they've got these short manes? Because if they were Roman at the time of Constantine, the Romans otherwise had their horses with flowing manes. And this is because there's a rebirth of interest in Greek sculpture in the 2nd century. So, cut a very long story short, I haven't cut it short at all, but anyway. You actually then have, who was the emperor at this time? It was Septimus Severus, who came out of North Africa, and it was his horses who were there. All right, so they've now identified them. And so, you see, when Napoleon was actually parading his spoils, there was a big sort of banner which said, from Chios to Rome to Constantinople to Venice, at last to Paris. All right, and this, of course, is no longer true. All right, and until very recently, there was sort of a gap of about 9 centuries, people trying to work out what was important. Now, we now come, again, we now jump, we've worked out that there were 3 sets of statues. We now come to the 4th Crusade in 1204. Under the blind 90-year-old Doge Enrico Dandolo. So history is full of these extraordinary people. Now, Dandolo, at this time, Venice was part of the Byzantium Empire. It at least owed fealty to the Byzantines, even though they actually didn't obey them particularly. But they had been the Venetians had been given trading rights in Byzantium. There was a kerfuffle, and the Venetians were kicked out, and so the Venetian Republic send their wiliest diplomat, Dandolo, over there. And while he is trying to negotiate, the Venetian fleet, which was coming to back him up, is struck by cholera, and the plague, I don't know what it was decimated, and so his negotiations fall into nothing, and he feels utterly humiliated. They think that he is probably hit on the head in a scuffle, and he suffers blindness from some kind of cortical injury, because his eyes, he didn't seem to have cataracts, he had very clear vision, and also he was sighted basically until then. And then after that, you see his signature goes from being perfectly clear to being able to remember what it looks like to not really being able to sign much at all. So, but anyhow, he, blind or not, he harbours utter hatred for Byzantium. He goes back, and because he's actually ended up negotiating finally quite well, and he's elected Doge. So his chance comes to get his own back, as it always does. During the time of the 4th Crusade, now the 3rd Crusade had been a bit of a disaster, and you get a new young Pope, Innocent III, I think, who's decided we've got to do this again, preaches the crusade. There's going to be 300,000 of people who are going to come to take the Holy Land back. And this was a theoretical route which the crusade was going to take. It was going to go from Venice, and it was supposed to go down here through Egypt up into Jerusalem. That's not what is actually going to happen. So all of these, they finally get the Crusaders arrive in Venice and ask the Venetians if they can actually use their fleet and take them across. The Venetians agree, but they say it's going to really cost you. And they sign an agreement, a non-negotiable agreement, All right, no matter what happens, you're going to have to pay X amount of dollars and a certain amount of booty. Crusaders think it's not a problem because they've got thousands of people who are going to come. In actual fact, only a third of the people who said that they'd sign up for the crusade turn up. And so they do not have the funds. Dandolo, then shrewd, realises that this is his big chance to actually assert the authority of Venice absolutely cynically using the Crusaders. And so he says, not a problem. I'll even supply my own ships, but we'll make a bit of a detour. We'll go down, we'll stop off at Zara. Now, Zara was a trading port, important trading port, which was rebelling against Venetian rule on the Dalmatian coast. And, of course, they always intended to go up to Constantinople as well, to take it and also take all of the relics and the riches. And so the Pope gets a little bit alarmed about this, but it's too late. Dandolo actually, makes a big speech. He puts the cross on his doge's hat, blind, and at 90 sails out with the ship. Now they get to Zara and besiege another Christian port, and take it. By now, the papal legate sort of, desperately sending things saying this isn't what we're actually besieging other Christians. The Pope writes back, excommunicate everybody. The papal legate's a bit worried because of his own life, and he sort of, throws the papal legate away, and they sail off. Instead of going to Jerusalem, they then make this detour up to Constantinople. They will never actually get to Jerusalem, all right? So this is a 15th century miniature of the taking of Byzantium by the Crusaders. It's led by the Venetians. Here you have the Venetians going in first. It was done on the sort of pretext, but in actual fact there was a squabble over the family as to who was actually the emperor of Constantinople. The Crusaders said, well, look, we're backing Alexius III, and we'll put him in power. They get there, sack the city, put the fellow that they wanted in power, and lo and behold, he can't pay. So what do? They then take every object of significance, monetary or spiritual significance, that is held in Byzantium at the time. So this is the sack of Constantinople, or the siege of Byzantium, which leads to murder, slaughter and mayhem, led with great cynicism by Dandolo. What do they bring back? Well, this is the time when they are going to sack the Circus Maximus and drag down all the statues that are there. Many of them are melted. Ones that are copper are melted, the others, I don't know what happens with the bronze, and bring back one of these sets of quadriga horses, which were, in other words, it was sort of symbolically taking the power and the history of this great city. All right, by possessing the horses, you possess all that pagan power that had been associated with the great ruler who had united the Roman Empire in 313 BC, right? So in other words, Venice is sort of taking over the mantle of this great power. But that's not all. Of course, they bring back all of the objects that are significant to Christianity. You get the crown of thorns is bartered off to somebody else. Baldwin gets that, but you get the blood of Christ, you get the right arm of St. George, you get, and of course you have to remember that these are terribly significant at the time. People, there were bits of the true cross, but also the entire bodies of St. Lucy, Santa Lucia. They even think St. Helena, St. Paul the Martyr. Do you want me to go on? No. Anyway, there were a number of these bodies that were brought back and are in the treasury of St. Mark's. Not just that, but the importance of display, which had been the role of the Circus Maximus in Constantinople is taken over now by the Piazza San Marco. So most of these columns that you actually see, the beautiful pieces of marble which are on the facade of the Doge's palace, are pieces of marble which have been taken from Constantinople or from areas that it governed. And by the way, at the end of the sack of Constantinople, Venice now takes over the Greek islands, and that's why you get outposts in Crete, for example, and a number, I'm trying to think, some more of those islands there. I was really surprised years and years ago when I arrived, and you get whole areas which belong to the Venetians. All right, you also then, of course, this is when you get these two strange structures. This is when the old Theodosius with his crocodile turns into a dragon. These are statues which are taken from Constantinople, from Byzantium, and the winged lion is actually a lion, and they've actually stuck some wings on it. But these are the ones that, of course, you see as you come across the Bacino when you come by gondola or by boat into St. Mark's. These are very significant. These are actually on the corner of St. Mark's Basilica, and these, I know exactly which church these have been taken from. This refers to Diocletian, the four emperors that existed before Constantine takes over. One of them is Constantine's father. So these are put in significant places. You know, you're not actually just going to have them in the treasury, but every time you walk past, you are reminded, or even at the time, of the supremacy of Venice. You know, these are put right on the front, of conspicuous consumption, if you want. And of course, in the treasury, you get these extraordinary works of art and jewellery which has been brought across. Enricus Dandolo dies and is actually buried in the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Istanbul. So the horses then have a great significance and are brought to Venice. Now, if you look at the St. Mark's Basilica, had these magnificent mosaics, but the Venetians are always changing right up until about the 15th century, in fact to the 18th century, they constantly change those mosaics. And so there's really only one door, lunette, above one of the doors of St. Mark's, which is actually 12th or 13th century, early 13th century. This is the St. Aleppo door, and you can actually see the horses there, all right? Now, you need to look at this. This is not a window, as we'll see. And the first thing to ask is, why have you now got a pagan symbol, a symbol of Constantine, symbol of chariot races, symbols of Roman emperors, symbols of Roman gods, above the door of the basilica, Christian basilica? Well, the Venetians very cleverly worked it in, as they do with most things, into biblical narrative. And there is evidently in the Old Testament Elijah ascending into heaven, and you'll notice that he's going up in a four-horse chariot, sitting rather awkwardly, as we would say, but it is a four-horse chariot. So therefore there's this precedent, and so the horses are placed there. Now, they now, as you can see, have the outer horses looking inward and the other ones looking towards. So you've actually got two pairs. Now this, by the way, could be done because these collars actually hide the fact that the horses are cast in several pieces, and the heads can be removed and probably belong to the other horses. Right now, why are they like this? I mean, you can see this again. Now, can you notice the difference here? Can anyone spot the difference? What's happened with? Well, no, you can't. All right. This is now a window. It's a window. Okay. Back here, you actually have mosaics, and so behind these horses, you would have had mosaics, and these mosaics now have been removed and put on another part of St. Mark's. This was done when they sort of thought that they'd update it, and in fact, you've got Christ, the king, in the centre. and two sets of saints, one of St. George and one of St. Mark, looking towards Christ, and two other saints looking towards St. Mark and St. George. So in other words, what has been done is that they have aligned the horses with this mosaic, which no longer actually exists there. So I think it's extremely interesting. Now, this, when Venice in the 1200s took these horses, they start to use the piazza, or in front of St. Mark's, in many ways the way that Constantine would have used the Circus Maximus, all right, for parades, this was actually showing off holy relics, as opposed to Constantine showing off his own power and the statues of the goddess of luck. So this is what we now have, which dates probably between I think it's 1279 was when that first door that I showed you was, and this, which is in 1496, so sometime between, they have taken out the mosaics and put up a window. Now, just to finish this off, these horses now become absolutely synonymous with Venice, all right, and with the ideal horse. So whenever, for example, with the legend of St. Martin, and Venetians depict a horse, it always has its foot or leg, like raised like this, very different from horses which really would have been flat out in a chariot race. And even when we get to Bartolomeo Colleone, it's exactly the same position of the horse. And in the 17th or the 18th century, with Canaletto, who does these extraordinary vedute for the English tourists, I mean, people got sick eventually of having, the Molo on one side, the canal. They wanted something different, and so Canaletto does what are called capriccio, where he takes parts of the history or parts of the architecture and places them in bizarre ways. Of course, they were never lined up in front like this, but what is it that actually people want to take away as symbolic or iconic of Venice? It is the horses, all right? Which, as we can see, really didn't belong to Venice for very, very long. Now, Napoleon, of course, enters this at the Treaty of Campo Formio. Now, he is going to negotiate with the Austrians. He sweeps across Italy, just finds that there's absolutely no resistance whatsoever. This is Napoleon in his young hairdo day. He hasn't lost the hair and so on. You will notice Napoleon over there underneath the lilies, the little shrine there. He hasn't got the hairdo there. So he very cleverly decides that he's going to be stuck between the Austrians where he is, and so decides to, in a secret negotiation, will give over Venice to the Austrians. And this is Napoleon's entry into Venice, which he does completely without even having to fire a shot. The Venetians grovelling come towards him as he arrives on the mainland, and by sheer chance a French ship enters the lagoon and is fired on by some incompetent Venetian. The French captain is killed, and Napoleon says, "That's it, we're moving in on you." The Venetian Senate and the Doge meet hurriedly. There's hardly anyone there. Instead of all the 700 that's supposed to be there, there's about 50. The others have already skedaddled, and they vote to end the Republic. So this is the end of Venice as this 1,000-year-old proud republic. And the symbol of it, of course, is the horses, and Napoleon will take them. It is his decision to take them. Now, Napoleon has many reasons for doing this. There are, some of the intellectuals in Paris were appalled that these horses were being taken, and one of them who signed a petition was David. But the official idea put forward was the Romans, once an uncultivated people, became civilized by transplanting to Rome the works of conquered Greece. Thus, the French people, naturally endowed with exquisite sensitivity, will, by seeing the models from antiquity, train its feeling and its critical sense.
The French Republic, by its strength and superiority of its enlightenment and its artists, is the only country in the world which can give a safer home to these masterpieces. And in fact, Napoleon pushes it even further and says, all men of genius, all those who have attained distinction in the Republic of Letters are French, no matter in what country they may have been born. So this was this idea that was taken from Winckelmann, that basically works of genius should fall to the most significant civilization or triumphant country of the time, and that art actually has a civilizing function. And so these great works of art should belong to the French. The other reason, of course, is that, look, the Italians would have let them crumble, and they wouldn't have, well, indeed, they were being sold off, ceilings being ripped off. But the other thing is that the French did, and this is not just me saying this, I can back this up by archives. The French were the foremost people in the conservation of artworks of the time, and also at the time of the French Revolution you have this real interest in the preservation of the past. You get the beginnings of, the Musée Napoleon, this idea of having a museum where you can actually look at your own heritage, which didn't exist anywhere else at the time. All right, so this then is where these will end up. Now, in 1815, of course, at the defeat of Napoleon, all of the works, the British, who are occupying Paris, in particular, insist that the French, magnanimously, the French give back all of their works of art. And William Hamilton at the time says, we, of course, everything in our museums, thank heaven, is really British. So they ask Canova. Now, Canova is the great sculptor who actually had worked for the Bonapartes. In fact, he had produced, you really sort of wonder if he was working against Napoleon at the time, with this dreadful statue of Napoleon as Mars the Peacemaker. Napoleon hated it so much he virtually put it in the cupboard. And it was captured and is now in Apsley House, at Wellington's house at the bottom of the staircase, so a perpetual humiliation of Napoleon. Anyway, Canova is given the job of getting back the works of art. Things aren't working very well, and so the British are brought in. Lord Castlereagh comes in, Hamilton is brought in, and Hamilton, of course, is the man who has been instrumental as being the secretary of Lord Elgin in bringing across the Elgin marbles to the British Museum. So we have this ultimate irony of the person who negotiates the release of the treasures to Italy, actually also at the same time having negotiated the release of the Elgin marbles from Greece. All right, so that is what's going to happen. The poor French, the English also want to demolish the Ark of the Carousel, but finally don't. In the end, what you actually now see, what you now actually see, reproductions where the horses' heads have been placed as a chariot should be. And of course, these are the sorts of things that you get on every, in Milan, in the Brandenburg Gate, and so on. All right, so I now want to get on to the next one, which is the Ghent Altarpiece. So here we have then, Vivant de Nantes, in the background, the Tuileries, where these great works of art were going to be taken. And the one that I want to look at now is the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, which some of us had the privilege of seeing when we were in Ghent. Now, this is one of the most significant works of art in the Western world. It's considered one of the 10 great works of art. I don't know how you actually catalogue this. Mainly because, as we'll see, it's sort of at the crux of medieval and Renaissance art. It's the first large piece to have been worked in oil. We think it's the first large piece. And because it's such a wide-ranging encryption, really, of all of the mysteries of Christianity. It's considered extremely valuable, mainly because during the time of the wars of religion, the 80 Years' War between the Protestants and the Catholics, many, or in fact almost all of the great altarpieces in the Catholic churches were built. In fact, someone actually talks about seeing bonfires, you know, from kilometres away. So maybe the fact that this is not so unusual, it's just that the others have disappeared, right? Anyway, we're going to talk about that in detail, but first of all, I want to talk about the fate of this. Now, in 1943, a man called Poser and I can't remember the name of the others, a group of people from the Monuments Men. Now, some of you have probably seen George Clooney with his helmet on crooked, you know. You know, it's amazing what Hollywood can do with something, you know. Anyway, so the Monument Men was a real group of people put together from 17 countries. I think the main contingent was from America, and then the British were next, who were people who are over 40, who were art historians, academics, you know, not the sort of people you want, you know, stumbling around a battlefield, basically, who were there to try and prevent the capture of the major works of art that Hitler was, as we'll see, attempting to take, and also the recovery of these. Now, they managed to find an SS officer who would give them information. This by 1943, as the Allies are coming up through Italy. I think by that stage, some of these officers defect, and he actually explains to these Monuments Men that there are at least 1,500 hiding places throughout Europe where these major works of art have been hidden. And that I think it's something like 5 million works of art had been taken, not just from the Jews, but from in fact, bought for paltry sums, and that's an important point. They weren't often just taken, they often, a piffling sum was given to them for them. But these were something like 5,000, and these were going to be set up by Hitler. So the Mystic Lamb was actually found in the Altese salt mine in Austria, where it had been moved, and there was something like 1,500 of these works of art. They'd been moved there by the SS, and the whole salt mine had been mined with bombs and was to be blown up if the Allied soldiers came too close. And it was only with the work of the Austrian resistance and the miners themselves. It really was a race against time. Very, very, they really just made it. And you've got some Michelangelo's statue that we saw in Bruges and so on. So here we have them actually finding, I don't know quite what this is, obviously pieces of paper stuck over it. Now, Hitler, of course, was a failed art student who'd failed to get entry into the Viennese Academy of Arts on 2 occasions, but considered himself an artist, and in actual fact was incredibly fanatically, as everything that he did, interested in art, and was really going to show those people who really didn't let him into the academy by collecting the most extraordinary works of art. And so here he actually has, like Napoleon, I have to say, a whole group dedicated to collecting artworks from everywhere. Now, his idea was to create at Linz, all right, not in Vienna, but near his own hometown, the Führer Museum, which was to be an immense museum. I think it was going to have 38 kilometres of corridors. If you can imagine, the V&A only has 8. Can you imagine how huge this was? And it was all to radiate out from the central part of, I think it was 19th century Aryan art, and radiate out into corridors with other masterpieces. In other words, showing how all the masterpieces of the world really come to finally, sort of in its apotheosis, is this Aryan sort of German art. So for this reason, it was considered that the Ghent Altarpiece was of great significance, right? But also for other reasons. I just want to show you Hitler's European Culture Centre plan for it. This is just the 38 kilometre corridor here. There was going to be a university, there were opera houses, there were theatres. It was going to be a massive cultural centre of Europe. So in other words, it's sort of a retake of Hitler's idea of the Louvre, of holding the masterpieces of the world. It never, of course, came to fruition. I think the only thing it was built was a bridge somewhere or other. But Hitler, even when he's in the bunker, you know, the days before he commits suicide, is still fascinated by looking at the maquette, you know, the model of what it is, and, you know, this is what, you know, I would have been here, and so on, sort of part of his megalomania. So I want to actually talk then about the itinerary or sort of this particular painting, which wasn't just taken or sought after desperately by the Third Reich. Now, it was painted by Van Eyck and is in the cathedral in Ghent, St Barbo's in Ghent. I think I might just leave that for the moment and talk about it. I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, it has it was, I think, as I told you, it's been stolen 13 times, all right, and it has a mysterious sort of background. Now, it was constructed in the 15th century. By 1566, you get the iconoclastic outburst of the Protestants, who come in and take down all of the statues. Here you see them bashing things down. You've got, this isn't a dead person, it's a dead statue. People actually carrying things off. Systematic pillaging of the church, not so much for gain, but this idea of you should not be worshipping icons, which of course they felt that the Catholics were doing. This happened on several occasions, and the Ghent Altarpiece, of course, was targeted, and it was only saved by being taken apart, because I think that's what I was going to tell you about this. It actually has 12 panels, can you see? That's when it's open with the idea, vision of paradise, and it's closed with the Annunciation, where everything starts, and this underneath. So these 12 panels were dismantled, taken into the tower, and people, some of the Catholic soldiers were prepared to die protecting the corridor. Anyway, it survived, and then was taken by the Napoleon in 1815, and he only takes the central panels, which we'll see, which is God the Father and the top part of it, and this is displayed in Paris. And some of the paintings of Napoleon as an emperor are based on the iconography of God the Father in the centre. So in other words, this was very important to Napoleon to have himself portrayed in this sort of majestic pose. In 1815, it's given back. The Allies give it back. In fact, the person who gives it back is Louis XVIII, who was the Bourbon who was restored to the throne, and he gave it back to Ghent because, like most of the French aristocrats during the Revolution and during the Napoleonic years, they had sought asylum in Ghent, all right, and they're called the Gondins. So that's given back. 2 years later, when the bishop of the cathedral is away, the canon of the cathedral sells the external panels to a British collector, and then this is bought by the King of Prussia, Ludovic, who wants to start his own museum to have it like the Louvre. All right, so it's dismembered. The First World War breaks out, and you've got Adam and Eve, which are by now in Brussels, have been given to Brussels. You've got the other four, which are in, at least the other panels, which are in what is more or less Germany, and you have the other ones which remain in Ghent. The soldiers, the German soldiers, come on at least 5 occasions to try and get the central panels, and on 5 occasions they are thwarted. So, at the end of the Treaty of Versailles, at the end of World War I, the Germans are forced to give back the panels that they had in Prussia. And this is considered hugely humiliating, and particularly by Hitler. It's seen as having taken back their heritage, and they're going to get revenge, and they're going to take the altar. In the meantime, all sorts of things happen. For example, Adam and Eve have been clothed because they were naked. Just a minute, what happened actually got there. Yes, well, what happens, yes. In 1932, there is a break-in into the cathedral, and some of the panels on the outside, the Just Judges, which is right, as we'll see when we look at the painting, is removed and the painting on the other side of it is taken. A ransom note appears and it says, you know, we want 500,000 francs or something, and you'll get it back. Nothing happens, and so the painting on the other side is given back, put in a railway, locker in good faith. The Belgian government say that they're not going to negotiate. They said, we're not Americans, we don't negotiate with criminals, and so there's 12 ransom notes which come and which they ignore. Right? There are a huge number of leads which are given at the time. No one takes any notice until finally, I think it's about 5 years later, a man who had actually worked in St. Barbo's Cathedral, his name is Arsène, I can't pronounce it, Gauthier, has a heart attack. And this is true, it sounds like something out of a penny dreadful, and calls his lawyer and says, look, I know where the lost panel is. You'll find the evidence of it in the drawer next to my bed, and then dies, you know. The lawyer doesn't alert the authorities, goes and he actually finds copies, carbon copies. You know, when you used to type things, you could put something behind of the ransom notes and some scribbled thing, but they can't make head or tail of it, and they bungle the whole thing again. This is why the French have it in for the Belgians, I think, this idea of bungling. All right, so finally nothing happens, and ever since then there has been this search for the lost panel, and it is still lost. They've actually, I think the cryptic thing that was written with these ransom notes, it is hidden in full sight, or is hidden somewhere where if it were removed everyone would notice it, or something like that. Some cryptic thing. That people think this means that it's actually hidden in St. Barbo's. They've done, you know, ultrasounds, whatever you do of the cathedral, can't find anything. Meanwhile, a panel was copied and placed there, so you just don't have a blank. And then something like 10 years ago, someone said, my God, we think it's the real thing that's been placed back there. No, that's not true. And now that you've got, during the Second World War, you then had the Germans coming and desperately trying to find this lost panel, right? The Ghent Altarpiece itself had been removed. People knew what the Germans were up to. They removed it to Pau in France, and it was on its way to the Vatican when it was seized by Goering. Actually, Goering, who actually was also fanatically interested in art. Actually, I've got a picture of Goering here reviewing. I mean, he picked the best pieces out of all of the French collection. So the two of them there having pieces of art shown. But he wanted it for his private collection, but he also wanted to ingratiate himself with Hitler. So he actually deployed a whole section of the SS to search for this lost panel, right? Extremely unsuccessfully. However, the person who was in charge of this, this goes on and on and on. In charge of this thing's widow has now given all of her husband's investigative material to the Belgians, and they are now trying to follow up to see if they can find out where it is. And the idea now is that all of these ransom notes were sent from different post offices, and if you put lines together, it's going to. It's a bit like the Unabomber, you know, and it's all going to be. It's evidently buried in the coffin of the king of Belgium or something like that. Right. So something. But anyway, the thing is, it's still lost. But it was of great significance to the Germans, first of all because of their this idea of humiliation. I'm going to have to go rather quickly over this. Now, it is lovely, isn't it? Do you want me to talk about the thing? Yeah. All right. Anything to have been stolen that number of times, it's supposed to sort of encapsulate all of these ideas of Christianity. Now, what was so interesting about this is that it plays very much with realism and the unreal world, all right, the seen and the unseen, and uses the seen in extraordinary detail to conjure up the unseen, all right? So it was commissioned by George Wicht and his wife Lisbeth, who had no children, in a chapel, and some of us have been there, in St Barbara's Cathedral. And so the lighting on the exterior that falls on these panels is real light that would have actually come in from a particular window. So you have very, very short shadows, black shadows coming across, which really depicts sort of the real world, because these people are of the real world, and even if these ones aren't, they're statues. So therefore these are the two St Johns, of course, St John the Evangelist and St John the Apostle, in reference to the name of the donor. Now above you have the Annunciation. So this relates very much to the story of Christianity. And above this you actually have the Cumaean Sibyls, who are supposed to have foretold the coming of Christ. And you have, I think it's Zechariah and Micah over here, who are the prophets who also foretold the coming of Christ. So this is incorporating the pagan world with the Old Testament into the New Testament here. Now what is fascinating here is you have Mary over here with this blank sort of space in the middle. And if you can actually look into it, you can actually go out into the city. It's quite possibly the city of Ghent, we're not really sure, but it is absolutely a real city with real things, and yet this extraordinary foundation act of mysticism is taking place. There is the man who commissioned it, and it's an unflattering portrait. Look, he's probably only in his 50s or something, but he looks about 100. He's got boils and acne and a bit of skin coming out here. It's absolutely no idealisation at all. So this is this new realism that you have. There we have the statues that you can see. Now this is the Annunciation, where you have this beautiful angel with the sort of the lilies as it is, and you can see she is saying "Hail Mary," and she is actually saying, "Behold, the handmaiden of the Lord." Now, throughout the altarpiece, there are numerous pieces of writing and references to books, and in fact, this is what the Germans under the Third Reich thought was so fascinating. They thought that there was some arcane message about the Holy Grail, which was actually encoded in all of these pieces of writing. Mary actually is saying things upside down and backwards so that God the Father over here can read it, right? Right, now there you can see the words coming out there. Now what is so amazing is that because this is done with oils, now oil painting, very different from fresco painting, meant that of course you could build up layer upon layer upon layer, which means that the surface becomes translucent. And so you can actually, every sort of hair is sort of picked out, every feather, all of these jewels, as we'll see later, actually reflect the light that is coming in, all right, and even reflect other things that can be seen. Now in the central panel, the dais as we have up here, this is the part that was taken by Napoleon, just this central part here. You have God the Father, is it Christ, or is it sort of, the Trinity? It's not really certain, but the whole thing is about redemption, all right? That's why it is the adoration of the sacred lamb. The sacred lamb, of course, appears in the book of Revelation, which means the salvation of mankind. So here we have this figure here who is sort of absolving mankind, and on the side you're going to get Adam and Eve with their sin and so on. So what I really want to look at, I suppose, is the beautiful way in which it is painted with this extraordinary detail of jewellery, of embroidery, with all of these words from the New Testament. He shall never grow old. He is the King of Kings. You have down here. And in the background you have all these beautiful references to the fact that Ghent and Flanders was, of course, the centre of the cloth trade. So here you have the symbol of the pelican who pulls, eats its own blood and gives it to its children in times of stress. In other words, sacrifice, which of course is what Christ is supposed to have done. Absolutely extraordinary pieces of jewellery, as you can see here. You can see exactly where the light is coming from, and because of the numerous layers of this, you get almost like 3 dimensions. There we get that again. All right, now I'll have to go through this quite quickly because I'm running out of time. We now have the Virgin Mary, who's shown as a bride with the symbols of her. She's the rose and, of course, the purity here, but also she's the Queen of Heaven with this magnificent crown. She's reading a book, which is most unusual for the Virgin Mary, and it's even more unusual to have John the Baptist reading a book. And this is why there's this sense that there is some written message in the altarpiece. This is St. John the Baptist with his goat skin underneath a magnificent cloak, and he, of course, is saying, "Behold the Lamb of God," because he was supposed to be a shepherd and all of that sort of business. He wasn't actually, but anyway. All right, now I just want to quickly look at these wonderful angels that you have on either side. Isn't that magnificent? All right, now, of course, you're supposed to have this idea of at the end of the world, there is going to be this the harmony of the end of the world, which is the musical harmony. And so angels here are singing. You'll notice that in this tradition, angels don't have wings. But here they are sort of not even idealized. They're all singing, and evidently musicologists can tell by the the shape of their mouths and where their tongue are what they're actually singing, whether they're actually singing soprano or mezzo or not. But do you see what I mean? Every hair is absolutely shown out, and the beautiful detail in their liturgical gowns. On the other side, you have the other musical angels, again with beautiful beautiful material. Now, I just want to get down very quickly to this part here. All right, on the outside, you have this permanent light of reality, which actually casts shadows of statues, casts shadows on human people. Whereas in the centre, when you actually get to paradise, which is the whole point of Christianity, from sin, from redemption, finally to eternal time, there is no such thing as light and shadows. It's this pure light which radiates from the eternal spiritual source of God. And so here you have the Holy Spirit radiating light, but which casts no shadows. And at the same time as that, you also get an extraordinary detail of every little flower flowers that weren't even currently, available in Europe. We don't even know where he gets some of them from. These are the irises, the different flowers, which all have symbolic meaning. So there we have poor old Adam and Eve. I won't really have time to talk about it, but even there it's symbolic insofar as you get the reality of it. You notice that there's actually a difference. He's got a red neck and red face, and his legs and feet are red, and his hands are red, and the rest of his body is plain. This is this idea he's not an ethereal creature. He's someone who is going to have to work. All right, and of course this is what happens when Adam and Eve have sinned and are cast out of heaven. She will have to bring forth children in pain, and he will have to work. And so this is referenced by the redness of the hands. All right, so in the centre you have the mystery of the Lamb of God. Here, with all of these groups of people converging on the Lamb of God, who actually has the chalice with his blood coming out, which will actually flow down here into the fountain of eternity. And we have groups of martyrs, female martyrs, male martyrs. Over here we have the apostles and members of the church, and here you have people from the Old Testament, I'll look at in a moment, all of whom are worshipping. So here we have the angels again. On the right hand side, these are these extraordinary drawings of the popes. All right, so you have these 3 popes here who were, this one is actually an anti-pope, remember the schism of the church. So this is this idea of even the schism, the anti-popes will come together on the day of judgment. This is Martin V's Alexander, one of the Alexanders, and I can't remember the one in the middle, I'm sorry. All right, on the other side, I didn't want to dwell on this too much, is all of the female martyrs. Here you've got St. Dorothy there with her roses, St. Barbara, St. Agnes. Here are the martyrs of the church, but also over here, people from ancient times who possibly have foretold the coming of Christ. So here you have Elijah with his twig, but here is Dante as well. Not Dante, I'm sorry, Virgil. Virgil, who was supposed to have said that a saviour will come. In actual fact, he meant Augustus, but that doesn't really matter when you're using Christian propaganda. So here we have on the outsides the just judges, which have been replaced. Now, I'm sorry, I have to really fly with this. So there we have a second work of art which has been sought after. And this time we're going to go back again to the Nazis in relation to Tacitus's Germania. Now, the German people really didn't exist as a nation at the time of Tacitus's writing. And they come together as an entity in the Germania, but he's the first person who actually talks about them as a nation, even though he specifies that they're made up of about 50 tribes. But that part is going to be elided by the Nazis when this is taken up as the foundation text of the purity of the Aryan German race, all right? But because there is no sort of archaeological objective evidence of it Germany being a united people, they fall back on this ancient document. So I have to very quickly go through this. We have to go to 3 AD at the time of Augustus, when the Romans had been trying to subdue the tribes in what is known as Germania, in other words, east of the Danube, isn't it? Yes, yes. And Arminius had actually been, the Romans were very generous to people whom they considered were valiant fighters, and he was the son of one of the captured Germanic leaders, and he was brought up in Rome and actually rose to power in the Roman legions, and in fact took part in Roman conquests of part of Cisalpine Gaul. However, there was one of his relatives was humiliated, and Arminius turns against the Romans, and in 3 AD masses some of the German tribes together, which was not easy. I mean, they all spoke different languages, but they did have in common that their land was going to be taken by the Romans. And he lures very cleverly, because he knows how the Romans fight, and he knows the ways in which to entice them, 3 Roman legions. Now, a legion was 5,000 men, and you would have 1,000 followers and auxiliaries. So 3 of these legions are drawn into the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, and Arminius manages to stretch them out in a narrow corridor, just pulling them on, so in a very narrow, something like a couple of kilometres wide, but something like 20 kilometres long, and then the tribes descend on them, and the entire legions are wiped out. All right, so in other words, what's that? About 20,000 are wiped out. So this is this major, the most major defeat that the Romans will ever undergo. And Augustus, never gets over it. He's supposed to have wandered around his house saying, "Varus, bring me back my legions." And of course, the Romans, the eagles, the 3 eagles, which we're going to look at next week, are lost. And this is again great sort of propaganda for the so-called Germans. Now, this is going to have a major effect on policy in the Roman Empire. They will abandon any attempt to go beyond the Danube. They abandon that completely, the Germans as being too difficult. And it's only, in fact, I think it was in the last 10 years that they've actually done archaeological surveys, and they've found where this actually took place, and just masses and masses of bodies that were slaughtered by these tribes. So this means that this is what the German tribes would look like now. We now skip to 56. This is Tacitus, who is the great Roman historian. Right now, he was a senator. He came out of the Roman aristocracy. He held a number of positions of power. You know, he wasn't just a scribbler. He was someone who was actually a governor of what is now Syria at one stage. He was a quaestor, he was a proconsul, and so on, and also was a great orator. And this is a time when oratory was actually beginning to fall into, you know, people had become rabble-rousers, and the rules of oratory were no longer very important. And so he decides he's going to turn to writing. And so this is when he writes the annals and the histories. And these are the basis of what we tend to know about the Julio-Claudians and so on. Now, there are huge gaps in what has come down from Tacitus. Many of the books have been destroyed. Now, the important thing is that he writes under the reign of Domitian. He doesn't write under the reign of Domitian, he actually lives through the reign of Domitian. Domitian was a tyrant, a Roman emperor who was a tyrant, who had abandoned trying to expand the empire, abandoned what Tacitus thought was the glory of Rome. In other words, we should still be fighting. But also it was considered that this was a time of great decadence of the Roman Empire. So Tacitus, when he finally gets the chance to write under the reign of Trajan, I'm sorry if this is getting a bit complicated, Trajan was the successor to Domitian, is relatively benign, and he is able to write this book, the Germania. He writes also the Agricola. Now, the Germania, it's a tiny little book. It's about 27 pages long. But he writes in glowing terms about these German tribes. Now, Tacitus had never actually been to Germany. You know, he was a soldier, but he hadn't been there. He was relying on, you know, trade views or military recounts that had come back. But he says several things, and one of the most important things he says, the tribes in Germanium, not tainted by intermarriage with any other nations, exist as a distinct, unadulterated people that resembles only itself. All right, this is where you're going to get this doctrine of racial purity. Consequently, all of them even share the same physical appearance: fierce blue eyes, tawny hair, and huge bodies. All right, so he then goes on to talk about them as having the men are incredibly loyal. They will, you know, they do not want to outlive their leader. And of course, this is going to be taken up by the SS, who actually have on their belts, you know, that I don't know what it is, Dorothy, but something in German sort of saying, my courage is I will courage unto death, you know, which is a reference basically to Tacitus. They're also supposed to have women who are completely untainted by adultery and therefore continue to produce, you know, legitimate children, which is always a sort of male fantasy. Also that they also got rid of people who they saw unfit. In other words, the disabled, the old, and those who could not be warriors and could not produce should also be dismissed. He also goes on to sort of say, who the hell would want to go to Germany? It's a ghastly place, it's marshes and it's awful. In fact, they're great warriors, but they're totally uncultivated, and so on. All of this, of course, these pages are sort of not taken up later on, as you can imagine. I'm running out of this. This is actually fascinating, I found. All right, so, well, I do anyhow. So what happens, all right, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, of course, Napoleon has basically dismembered, you know, the sort of the old monarchs and the principalities and so on of what, you know, would consist of Germany. And so the Germans actually have to fall back on ideas of who they might be, all right? And so they turn to language, and they turn to this sort of ancient document which has been produced by Tacitus. And so you get a number of people, I'll have to cut this very short, who is what they call the Volk. I have to ask. Volk? The folk. Thank you. The Volk movement, which is a 19th century movement, a romantic sort of movement, going back to this idea that the German people at one stage were pure. However, my God, look at what's happened. We need to actually go back to the roots of this, and this is in the countryside. It's not in the cities. It's the basic peasants. These are the pure German stock. You know, these are the people who are referenced by Tacitus. And it's based on a kind of whole lot of mysticism, of legends, you know, that are going to eventually come out with Wagner. Well, this is happening by now in the 19th century. The Germans are trying to sort of find a sense of identity. And it's also against a background, look, I'll just go at about 5 minutes over if that's all right, a background of the beginning of discourse about the importance of race. And first of all, you have Gobineau, who's a Frenchman who produces his essay on the inequality of the human races in 1853, where he divides the races of the world up according to colours, a bit like you had with the chariot races before. You've got the blacks, who he says are sort of really very strong but incredibly unintelligent and can't do anything, you know, have a civilization. These ideas continue very much up until, you know, 21st century. The yellow races, the Asians, who are very, you know, spend a lot of time being interested in consumerism. They're relatively clever but not very strong. And then you have the white races, of course, who are the only ones capable of appreciating beauty, appreciating the higher things of civilization, and who themselves are the epitome of beauty. And amongst these Caucasian races, you have one group which is supreme, and these are the Aryans. And he identifies these people as actually having come down, actually been in India at the time, and he sees the caste system in India as being a reflection of the Aryans being at the top and the Dravidians being the untouchables at the bottom. So this then is this idea that the only civilization can only be driven forward by these white people, and if you get anything that happens in amongst these other cultures, it's because there's been a mixing of white blood. So white blood was what brought civilizing ideas to other people. He was, however, extremely pessimistic. He looked around and he looked at what had happened in France, and he decided that it was basically these Aryans, unfortunately, had married with Mediterraneans, and the whole thing had been dragged down to a very bad level. So he ends his discourse on the inequality, and he also manages to see also climate adding it to it. The hotter the climate, the more hopeless people were. You know, so anyway, we won't go there. So we have this, then all of these ideas actually feed into this folk movement, which will be the basis of the ideas of the Reich. Now, the person who is fascinated by this is Himmler, right? Now, Himmler, who of course will be the leader of the SS and of the Gestapo, who was fanatical about this idea of the purity of race. And that quotation that I read to you from Tacitus is the basis of his credo. And he reads one day in the train, he reads Tacitus, and there's this light bulb moment that he realises this is such an important book. And so other writers at the time, Gunther, for example, writes Death and the Death and the Devil, something or other, where he talks about the importance of National Socialism, the ABC of it, and they begin to teach in schools this importance of purity of race. Now, Himmler is someone who all his life is going to go on these wild pursuits of trying to prove the Aryan purity of the Germanic race. Now, originally Hitler thought he was a bit unhinged. In fact, they all actually sort of used to giggle about him behind his back. In fact, there wasn't too much giggle by the time he came to power as the sort of second most important person in the Reich. But this meant that he finally persuades Hitler. Now, Hitler actually makes a number of statements. I actually haven't got the quote. he sort of says, look, I wish Himmler had sort of, take a break from this business of Tacitus. He said, if you actually read Tacitus, it sort of says that while the Romans were sort of out building bridges and conquering and writing great treatises, we were stuck in mud huts. I don't really think this is the way we wish to be portrayed. However, that is overridden by this idea of purity, of extermination, of the degenerate nature of society, of the Western world. It is now up to the Germans to this Nordification and the recovery of Western civilization through this eradication of the degenerate. And so this is where you actually have the beginning of the Hitler Youth. Now what is rather amusing is if these are supposed to be tall, strong, blonde, you actually look at Hitler, Goering and Himmler, all of who are dark, short, fat, or else actually couldn't, actually serve in the First World War because they had some kind of disability. But anyway, so we actually have this, the typical Aryan woman there happily producing blonde children. Now, let's get back to the text. So what has happened to the text? I just need 5 minutes. Right, so it was written in 96 AD and then disappears, like much of Tacitus's writing. And then resurfaces in 826 at the German monastery of Fulda, where it is copied. And so that is the first, and then disappears. So they then have a copy, but it disappears. You then get the Piccolini popes who actually hear about this, during the Renaissance there's this renewal of interest in ancient texts, and I can't remember which pope he was, but he belonged to the Piccolomini family, has the copies brought to Rome. It disappears then again and is found in 1902 in a family of the Baleani noble family in Jesi in the south of Italy. And it had evidently been there since the 1400s. By now it is known to exist, and Hitler by now is at a stage of the war where things are going against him, and there is this increasing obsession with the discourse and the having proof of the superiority of the Roman, of the German people. As I said, there's no archaeological evidence or anything else. And so he, in 1936, actually before this, when he has Mussolini coming to the games in Berlin, he asked Mussolini to bring Tacitus's original manuscript. Mussolini sort of agrees. There's an outcry in Italy and actually turns up and saying, well, actually, no, I haven't got it. And so then the Germans embark, as they had with looking for the Ghent Altarpiece. Divisions of the SS are sent out, at a time of crucial time, when the Allies are coming up through Italy, to scramble to get this document. And they actually go through all of, the houses of the Jesi family. God knows what happened to the poor Jesi family in the, tortured or something, but they never actually get hold of the document. It actually was in the basement of another house, and it's now actually in the library, I think, in Rome. So this then, I suppose, is the sort of this fascination that people have with these objects of plunder, to construct an identity for a nation, to construct a mythology, as the Venetians had, or as did Napoleon. Now, what is the status of plundered art at the moment? This will just take me 5 minutes. Is this all right? Now, this is very interesting. In the last few months, the Louvre has actually opened up special rooms which are hung entirely by plundered art. Now, in other words, you actually plundered by the Germans, by the Reich. I'm sorry, by the Nazis. I'm sorry. Not plundered by Napoleon. That's so all of these have been set up, and anyone who has sufficient justification can claim these works of art. And so what the Louvre is actually doing, of course people are saying it's too little too late, is attempting to give this back, but also the French have changed a law which was passed in the 1500s of the inalienability, I can't even get the word, but the fact that, yes, thank you, of art that belonged to the Crown or the French state. And they have now quashed that law and actively repatriating, if you wish, not just works of art, but anthropological objects, for example, skeletons and skulls and so on. Now, first of all, before I get into that, they also are trying to get away from the idea of the Universal Museum, which is what the Louvre was. And I don't know whether you know that, for example, the Louvre now has two branches. There's one in Abu Dhabi, there's one in Lens. And so many of the masterpieces that are theoretically, you know, in the Louvre in Paris that you go and see with your students, and you've gone all the way over there and it's not there. It's somewhere. But it's this idea of disseminating it, and of course they are now going to even lend the Mona Lisa. So this is a definite move away from this idea of the Universal Museum as being a kind of a zoo, an artistic zoo where you can view the rest of the world from your privileged position in the centre of Europe, right? Because it's all, they're saying that basically this is a 19th century view. There are great problems, of course, particularly now everything is now open for being given back. What's the first problem? The first problem with the artefacts of skulls and so on, when they're not actually named, it's not like Bloggs's head, it's just skulls. The anthropologists are saying, well, look, you know, they are now going to be buried, they will disintegrate, we are going to lose this evidence. And they're saying, well, look, 20 years ago, everyone said, look, you've measured those bones, why do you want to keep measuring them? But then you get DNA, and you get all of those things that come. So there are all these scientific problems. The second problem is, of course, does the country exist that you took it from? And there's a very good example of this. The Swedish, I think in the 16th century under Queen Christina, took all of the treasures of what is now Prague, including the Silver Bible. And now the Czech want it back, but actually, I think at the time they weren't Czech. So who do you actually give it back to? So it's rather difficult. However, the marriage of Cana, I'm not sure how come there hasn't been a major demand that these things be taken back. Now, I do actually have to mention this, I'm very sorry. Now, one of the arguments also that has always been considered valid was that, oh, we paid for it, all right. That it was a legitimate sale. Well, that is really sort of largely irrelevant, and there's a law which was passed in 1954 saying that if you end up even buying from a second person art which has been plundered, ignorance is no excuse. You know, you still have to give it back. But the problem, I suppose, here is with the fact that the British, at the time when they were forcing the French to give the horses of St Mark back, also had this acquisition of the Elgin marbles, which Canova was invited to go and see after he dispatched the horses back to Venice. He was invited by Hamilton, William Hamilton, to go and have a private viewing of the Elgin marbles. So in other words, getting back to this then, is that the fact that you bought them is of no consequence. Also, research that I actually did looking at the Nazi acquisition is that in many cases they actually did buy them. You know, that there was a bill of sale, something worth $10 million, they actually gave you $50 or something, but there was some kind of legal thing that took place. So the second thing is, you can no longer sort of say these countries can no longer look after their own works of art. And so with the breakup of empires, and in fact with the breakup of Europe, with Brexit and so on, and the emerging nationalism of countries that were former colonies, or parts of different worlds such as Turkey, India, New Zealand, you know, maybe even Australia, you know, they are actually demanding back these works of art. So the Elgin marbles is a really very interesting case. The country that they came from, the city that they came from, exists exactly as it did before. It's still a city, it's still in Greece. You actually have the Parthenon, which is still there, and a major museum which has been built to look after these. So, you know, on what basis can you still keep these? I think there was negotiations were looked into after the Brexit vote as to whether perhaps these should be given back. And I think a poll was taken, and this was amazing. I'm sure, Hugh, you wouldn't have been one that voted in this, but 93% of the British who said they wanted to keep the Elgin marbles, which I think is very interesting in relation to clinging to an identity of cultural superiority. So anyway, I just wanted to, the Rosetta Stone, I haven't got time to talk about that. So anyway, so let's end this by then looking back at the horses of Venice. Are they the horses of Venice, or are they really the horses of Istanbul? So I'd like to end there.